Today's talk is being recorded. We have the meeting controls set to mute all participants upon entry, but you can use the chat function to ask questions and participate in the talk. Today's talk is number 5 of 6 scheduled for this semester, and it's titled Vinyl Records, the Most Improbable Rebirth of the 21st Century. And I'm very pleased to introduce Professor Larry Jaffe from the Department of Communication Arts. Thank you, Professor Jaffe, for being here today. We're ready when you are.
Okay, thank you, Elizabeth, and thank you, Dan, for allowing me to give this presentation. One of the things that journalists usually do is write about what they're passionate about. And for me, that happens to be vinyl records. When I'm not teaching in New York Tech classrooms, which I've done since 2013, I'm usually thinking about vinyl records. And in fact, my students, I'm sure, often notice that I walk in the classroom with a bag of records. But what's intriguing about this comeback is that it makes absolutely no sense on any grounds. And I'll go into more detail about that. But the first slide you're seeing there are the top 5 top-selling vinyl records of 2019. Obviously the Beatles and Pink Floyd especially are perennial sellers. They're not going away anytime soon. Queen, I'm sure, was helped by the film Bohemian Rhapsody last year. Guardians of the Galaxy, like a 1980s soundtrack. I guess younger baby boomers certainly could relate to that, but millennials especially, as well as Gen Z, were into that soundtrack. But I think the most promising is Billie Eilish, which I think ended up number 2 on the, or maybe even number 1 in terms of the ranking of number of units sold. She's only, I think, 18 years old now. She represents the future, and why vinyl, I believe, is not going away. I am going to play images from this film that was just actually premiered last weekend. It was to coincide with Record Store Day, which unfortunately had to be postponed because of the coronavirus. It's only about a little over 2 minutes. The audio, Elizabeth and I have been testing, is not coming through good enough. So I'm just going to speak over it, and it gives you a good overview of this comeback. So, some of these people are audio professionals, and a lot of them never stopped working in the vinyl space. They were also mastering for CDs and digital when that began as a thing, such as Spotify. And actually, that's one of the things that has helped them during the coronavirus. I'll talk a little bit about that more. I mean, a lot of these people work from home. They have their gear, right there, and they don't even have to really practice social distancing. But as you can see from these images, retail stores have been really places to be over the past decade, especially. And a lot of that is due to Record Store Day. I'll talk a little bit more about that. And the space that stores are allocating for vinyl has increased exponentially. You saw the CDs there. I mean, some of these stores are still selling CDs. And in fact, half of their revenue, believe it or not, comes from CDs. That's United Record Pressing, that will glimpse there. That's the biggest factory in the United States now. In this film, by the way, you see how the ages of consumers cuts across demographics. Now, some of it is like little kids. Some of it is baby boomers like myself, and I'm sure many on the call. But interesting enough, my own anecdotal research shows that between 25% and a third of the people I'm talking to, and I ask them about vinyl, they're into it, they get it. In many cases, they still own their vinyl, never threw it away. Sorry about that. I'm just trying to stop this. Trying to advance the slide. Here it what does it say? I'm just stuck in this slide. Let me just see if I move out of that, we can move on. Okay, so Mark Twain has this famous quote. The actual quote was, "The report of my death was an exaggeration." It's been reworded in many different ways. But he said this in 1897. What's interesting about the timing of this is, and also the quote in itself, it sums up the vinyl comeback. Because if you look back at 20 years ago, people would have thought that vinyl was dead and buried at that point. Not the case. And what's also interesting about this date is 9 years earlier, Emil Berliner, a German inventor, created the first what he called phonogram, but it was a circular record. And the production, the mass production process was not that different from the way that records are being manufactured today, over 100 years later. So what goes around comes around. And obviously the Beatles actually turned the music industry into something that teenagers especially were willing to spend real money on. Even in the 50s, the popularity of Elvis Presley, it wasn't so much a record type of phenomenon. It was more of a television once he was on Ed Sullivan. It was a radio phenomenon. But that you could bring home music, even though it did, like I said, existed in the 20s, 30s, 40s, it was still a sort of niche consumer product. Those of you remember the 8-tracks, every car had either an 8-track or a cassette player in the late 60s, early 70s, mid 70s, even late 70s. The advent of the CD in the early 80s was a ploy by the record industry to reinvent itself. And the CD is actually very important to me personally from a career perspective, because for about 8 years, up until 2006, I had edited a magazine that was devoted to CD and DVD production. But we saw the writing on the wall around 2001, 2002, when Napster was, going through its legal battles and peer-to-peer was happening, and the first inkling of streaming could happen. And then Apple actually sort of changed the game for about a 4 or 5 year period by getting people used to downloading MP3s and buying them. But that actually petered out within the last 5 years. The interesting thing is records never really went away, and I'll get into the numbers in a little while. But as I showed in the first opening slide, the Beatles were either number one and number 2 best-selling record last year, so their popularity hasn't waned at all. So this comeback doesn't make sense on any level. Technological grounds, streaming rules. It is so much easier. We're in the digital age. Why would you go to an analog process? It just doesn't make any sense. On economic grounds, it's expensive to make a record. Small margins all the way around the supply chain. Hard to make a profit. On ecological grounds, it's a fossil fuels-based, raw materials, heavy for that goes into the composition of a vinyl record. And on manufacturing grounds, these plants are dependent upon 50-year-old machinery and spare parts that aren't easy to come by. And it's a lot of times that people find them on eBay. I'll get into one anecdote about that. So I mean, I asked the question: what's easy to use this illustration, which is not that far-fetched. I mean, it looks like a Rube Goldberg solution, but it actually is very true to the process. And I want to thank on the call my co-founder of Making Vinyl, Brian Eakes, who had commissioned an artist in Europe to produce that illustration. Unfortunately, I don't remember her name. But on the right, I mean, obviously, to get the world's music within split seconds in your fingertips, I mean, it's just an incredible tool. And just on a personal level, I use Spotify on a daily basis. And I use it mostly for music discovery. If I really like a record, I mean, like an album, I will then search to see if I can find the vinyl version of it. And you know, I mentioned before, it's hard to make a profit on a record. I mean, I guess the best example of this is Tower Records, which had a huge footprint all over the world. And then in 2006, they finally went Chapter 7 bankruptcy. One of the things last year, I had started working with the owners to the Tower Records brand that was purchased out of bankruptcy. And I did some work for them. And we were planning this big relaunch of the brand in 2020. And then, of course, the coronavirus hit and, you know, everything's on hold for the time being. It was not, the plan was not to come back in the same way that Tower existed previously. And by the way, Tower never went away completely. In Japan, there are several fairly large stores that was a separate entity, although they retained the rights to the name. So I mentioned that it's not very ecological. And the reason for that is what you see on the right bottom corner is the PVC pellets. And PVC, in most instances, contains a toxic material, often lead. And in fact, in Europe, the EU had banned the use of PVC pellets containing lead. That's not the case in the US, although some of the plants do go out of their way to use the PVC that does not include the toxic materials. And anytime you walk into a record pressing plant, you see equipment that looks like this. And in many cases, it's like 50-year-old machinery. And there are only a handful of experts who really know how to work this stuff or fix it when it does break down. On the upper right corner, there's an individual here who's based in Nashville who he spent $25,000 buying various pieces of what's known as a lathe. And the lathe is required to, once it reaches the mastering stage, you know, after you're in the recording studio and you have a record that you want, it has to then go into mastering, which will, you know, set the levels so that it's you know, so it sounds okay. And then it has to then reach the manufacturing phase. So that's what this lathe does. And it requires a blank piece of plastic type material called a lacquer. So you can't make a record without a lathe. And that's like there's in fact a group on Facebook or on the web called the Secret Society of Lathe Trolls. And it's a very interesting group to listen to their you know, the things that they grapple with on a daily basis. Now, for the past 15 years, there's been exponential growth of records. And for the first time in 2019, the dollar amount for the records outsold CDs. Now, what's interesting about that number, that figure, is that there were actually more units of CDs sold, probably 3 or 4 times more CDs than vinyl. The reason why the dollar amount is that a record, the average retail price is $25. And here's one of the ironies of this. And I said, what goes around comes around. When CDs started, if you remember, they were fairly expensive because we would pay, you know, $7, $8 generally for an LP. You know, some like Crazy Eddie, some retailers would practically give it away as a lost leader. So you could get it for $3.99. Sam Goody used to have these little coupons that I used to use all the time. So we thought that was so crazy to spend that kind of money for the same record, you know. And I have to admit, the first time I heard CDs, I was like, wow, no surface noise, no skips, no, you know, there was some benefit to it. The portability, of course, was especially great. In fact, I meant to put in the slideshow, there's a great photograph of Muhammad Ali with a portable 45 player in his car. I would love to have one of those if it was possible to buy. So, I mean, getting back to why did the comeback happen? Well, what happened in 2007, a group of independent record stores were pondering their future and whether they would survive. And one of them said, you know, comic book stores have something called comic book day. Maybe we should do something like that. And it was from that germ of an idea that they were managed to get some momentum in the industry. They had the good fortune of attracting a major artist, Metallica, to release a limited edition record that sold out almost immediately. And there were others that also were in this list. And that was 13 years ago, and only the list has expanded year to year, and it's also, the sales have never gone down year to year on Record Store Day. They also introduced at some point, I think about 5 or 6 years ago, Black Friday. So it was the second day during the year that you could buy limited edition records. This slide here shows Looney Tunes in West Babylon, New York, which is one of my stops on Record Store Day. And again, it was one of the things that I missed out on this last week, and I didn't let that stop me because e-commerce works very, very well, and there's a app called Discogs that basically gives you access to the world's record sellers, I mean globally, and about once a week I've been receiving a delivery of you know, records that I've coveted or brand new releases. So, you know, to sum up in terms of, you know, digital downloads undeniably are a fantastic invention. And for $10, that's the paid subscription model. It's a fantastic thing to have at your fingertips. But there are individuals who, you know, covet a physical thing, that streaming to them seems like a ethereal, you know, background music, not as involving as a physical record is. Not true. I mean, if you put on a CD, it's just a matter of pressing a button, and you really don't think about it as much after that. One of the things about the CD world that I never liked were the packaging was tiny. I couldn't understand why they made the printing so microscopic in the booklets. And the interesting thing is the major labels especially hated printing those little booklets and started trying to move them online, in fact. In the mid-2000s. But also, you know, records in particular make a fantastic gift because, you know, your family member or your friend knows what kind of music you like, he knows who your favorite artists are, or you might even have like a wish list of what you would like to receive, you know, and you share that with them. So, you know, I think vinyl is like comfort food. And here's a Peanuts comic strip where Linus tells his sister, Buying records cheers me up. Whenever I feel low, I buy some new records. And I think living with coronavirus, actually, I could identify exactly what Linus is feeling here. Maybe some of you also have thought that. So here are some numbers, and it really shows you how the growth has taken place over the last 15, 16 years, especially from this one chart. This came from the RIAA. Now, the lion's share of that blue was back in 2004, CDs. And you'll see there's been a slow decline. And of that, even back in 2004, all the way to 2011, the final portion of that blue section was just a blip on the screen to some extent. But it started picking up later. But the bigger piece of as streaming caught on, physical media became a much smaller piece of the pie, as you can see from this. The source of this information is from the RIAA. And one of the things that I've had, and I've done much writing about this subject, is that the numbers that are usually announced are very suspect because they're at best guesstimates. And a few years ago for the Audiophile Voice magazine, I did something of a expose about, saying it's ridiculous that they say, vinyl's back, but it's not back at the level that really is happening in the marketplace. But you could see just, saying, all right, if their numbers are correct, that streaming is almost 80% of the pie there. And you can see how far, and I remember this was like something that the industry, the physical media industry actually sort of enjoyed, that the media industry exceeded the digital downloads, meaning pretty much iTunes. And there are other, Apple Music, I guess. Now, I don't know if they do much on the MP3s, but there are other there are other ways you can get, especially high-res audio downloads is another possibility. But again, it's a very tiny, tiny niche. Of the 10% that the physical is listed there, about half of it is considered to be vinyl, half of it's CDs. And here's the key stats, and this puts it over the last 20 years to perspective, that in 2000, 942.5 million CDs. And that was at a time when my magazine was really doing very well, by the way. And only 2.2 million LPs were shipped that year. In 2006, it went down to 619, which is still, about a third less than you were getting back in 6 years earlier. But vinyl dropped down to 900,000 LP units. Again, this is from the RIAA. But on the other hand, in 2019, and you could see how that marketplace really quickly, diminished to 46 million units when compared to 942.5 19 years ago. But LPs, on the other hand, rose to 19.1 million. Now, I say that that's a suspect number, and I'll tell you why. I'm just going to go up. Well, I'll get to it in a little bit. I'll get it. I'll just put that on the back burner for a second. Okay, but the vinyl never really went away, and there were like three distinct groups of people that kept it alive. Part of that was the old school club DJs, who never really adopted doing it digitally, which is certainly easier. And DJs often complained about having to carry their, record collections, 100 records every night all over the place. I've heard stories about people having their records stolen at nightclubs, which is really horrible to hear. Then you have the audio files, and this, below that is the famous Maxell um, commercial. Well, I guess there was a television commercial, and there was also a print advertisement. The funny thing is, I never really considered myself an audiophile, although I've written for audiophile magazines. And part of that is I never really had the disposable income to take advantage of that. But I admire the people who can, and I wish I was one of them. But I, as soon as, if somebody gave me $300 instead of buying a $900 turntable, I would take the $300 and put it into records, and know that I could get better sound, but I'm okay with what I'm listening on. And then also the hoarders, and a lot of this is, people go to thrift stores, or they look on the street and people are junking their record collections. And also, on the personal level, after my magazine closed in 2006, I was trying to live a different lifestyle. And I was getting ready to move, and I actually ended up selling most of my record collection, which was close to 4,000 CDs. I kept about 100 of them. I sold 4,000 CDs. I sold probably 2,000 DVDs. I was trying to practice I guess they call it feng shui. And within 2 years of that, interestingly enough, I didn't miss the DVDs and I didn't miss the CDs that much, but I did miss the records, and I realized what a big mistake I had made. But who's buying records today? It's the baby boomers, like my age group. This is the original couple who were on the Woodstock famous iconic cover. And then surely baby boomers like me are on a nostalgia kick, looking to relive their fondly remembered youth. And I can relate to that very much so. But it's also Gen Z and millennials. By the way, my daughter is only 22 years old, and she really loves vinyl now. And we go to record stores occasionally together. And we haven't done a record show. Hopefully we'll be able to do that sometime soon when she gets back from college. She's in Memphis, which is a great music town and has great record stores. I visited 2 years ago, and we hit the major record stores there. And interesting thing is that it's not guys, that women, 48% are buying records as well. And it sort of reminds me of when the internet first caught on as a commercial medium, and how, the sexist regard that the only, it was a guy's thing, because they understand technology better. It was like so sexist. And then they realized that the numbers, that their initial numbers were way off, and that women were into it. This may sound like a cliche, but e-commerce and shopping had something to do. But guys, buy online too, especially now, where that's like that's keeping retail afloat for the most part. Okay, so back in July 2017, I was having conversations with some of my colleagues that I've done various conferences over the years, DVD conferences or optical media conferences. And one of these organizations said, well, actually, to be honest, and my colleague Brian Eakes is on there, he probably remembers the conversation. I actually said in 2012, I sent him an email and I said, what about a vinyl conference? I don't think it's going away. I think it's a real thing. And it might have been too much too soon in 2012, and wisely we didn't take the plunge then. But in 2017, I think it was about February of that year, Brian had said, you remember that idea you had about doing a vinyl conference? And I said, yeah. He goes, I think it might happen this year. And I was like, really? I was like completely astounded that it was that was being considered. But then meanwhile, as we were having these finalizing conversations to whether we were going to do the event, the Wall Street Journal comes out with this ridiculous article that was based on so many half-truths and did not reflect the real market at all. There was one thing about it that is true, and it holds true today. They pointed out that a lot of the records, at least back in 2017, the majority of them were not using analog sources and were, basically just taking masters that we use for CDs, for example, and just, jumping on the bandwagon as a quick way to make some money. And unfortunately, that is to somewhat true even today. But, Brian and I, we were saying, is this the wisest thing? How much, reach does the Wall Street Journal have with this type of article? I actually tried to engage in a conversation with the Wall Street Journal reporter. He did actually respond at one point to an email I sent him. And I invited him to come to our event to see, that perhaps he was wrong. He never came. So, but we created this B2B conference called Making Vinyl, and we proved the concept that it was not a fad, and that it was a real industry waiting to burst out. And this is the Westin Hotel in Detroit that we filled the ballroom, and we had the good fortune. This is Brian on Jack White's right. We had the good fortune of having Jack White as our keynote speaker. Jack has been, a proponent of vinyl. He first came to be known as half of the duo called the White Stripes. Basically puts his money where his mouth is. And when we were coming up with the potential speakers for the event, he was at the top of the list, and he was the person who made the most sense. Also, kind of interesting, and Brian's actually a lot closer to this than I am in terms of finding locations for our events. One of the things about Jack is that he lives in Nashville, but he grew up in Detroit, as did Brian, by the way. And originally, we were planning on doing the event in Detroit, but the hotels were so expensive that we couldn't really find something that made sense. And there were so many other events going on. And so then, Detroit just seemed to make so much more sense because Jack had just built his plant and opened it in February of 2017 there. So he had some experience by that point of how to make a record. I'm going to show a slide next. So we had, in addition to Jack, we had Daryl McDaniels, DMC of Run DMC, the pioneering rap group, who's fantastic motivational speaker, and feels that a lot of his career is owed to vinyl. So on the bottom here is Third Man Pressing, which I have to tell you, I've been to at least a dozen pressing plants. None of them look like this one. Jack White is very particular about color schemes, and yellow plays a major role, and so does black. And it's really fantastic to be there and seeing it operational. The other thing about it is we had, I think, about 10 different groups that received tours after the program portion of the conference was over, who got to see this. And one of those groups, Jack actually led the tour. I was not among those, and I was so envious to find that, because I would have loved to. I did have the good fortune, though, of introducing Jack, which was a kind of fun experience, because I only learned about 30 seconds before that I was doing that, and I hadn't really prepared enough material. But also on the slide above is the from the Nashville headquarters of Third Man Records, and he has a phone booth where you could record a record. Apparently during the 40s, this was somewhat commonplace. And Neil Young actually about 7 years ago recorded an entire album in that very booth. So, I mean, one of the things also, if you build it, they will come. Basically, we proved that. And what we found out in these networking breaks is that deals were being made, and that people who have been sitting on the fence, thinking about opening up a factory about vinyl records, went ahead and did it the following year. And we had at that first conference, we had about 7 or 8, I think 7 new pressing plants, as well as 5 existing pressing plants that had never stopped making records. So how do we stop it? How do we top it? We knew we were onto something. And in fact, there was another 7 who were up and running, 7 new pressing plants that were up and running, were eager to share their experiences getting into this business. And then, I was looking for a keynote speaker, and I was a big fan of Little Steven's radio show. And at the end of it, one night, around midnight, I was driving home, and he said, people say, how do we get in touch with me? Well, Twitter, And I'm not a big Twitter user, but I figured, I'd give it a shot. And sure enough, the next day he responded and said, interested, tell me more, here's my guy, email the details, And, over the next 3 or 4 weeks, we were managed to make a deal. And we hit almost 400 people. So we expanded by 50 the second year. And, well, no, I'm sorry, we went from 300 to 350 the second year in Detroit. We outgrew this room, and actually we changed the layout of the hotel. And what we, and you remember I went back to that chart about the numbers and how suspect they are. This is why I know for a fact that it's grossly underestimated, because at the time, we had the half-year report from the RIAA that said that 9 million records were shipped. And there were some individuals in the audience that almost did 9 million records themselves, And I actually, that's me at the podium up there, I actually asked the audience, how many of you think this number, 9 million, is low? And from the audience, people were yelling way low, and then anecdotally, I went around and found out that, it's at least twice that size, maybe more than that. I mean, it's just kind of frustrating. So then we decided to move to Los Angeles last fall, and we hit 400 attendees. In between, also in May of last year, we did another event in Europe. It was our first European event, and we held it in Berlin. We actually used the actual physical space where David Bowie recorded Heroes, and many other major recording artists, such as U2, also had recorded in that room. That was just a thrill for me, because Heroes has always been one of my favorite songs. We had that room capacity as well. It was much smaller than this one. I mentioned before about the ecological problems with records. Well, there's some new technology that's trying to solve that problem and remove or use different types of materials and use less energy. And so there's this group in Holland called Green Vinyl. And then there's also another group called HD Vinyl that also removes the electroplating stamper stage of record making, which also requires some toxic chemicals and stamper. I mean, it requires a money-intensive piece. Today, neither one of those entities have really caught traction with the industry, and I hope that they do find the right partners to make it happen. But they've been working at it for a few years already. So who needs PVC when you you could use soap. I am going to just change the screen to show you what. 1 second. There we go. So obviously, this is a gimmick, right? But on the other hand, it's not. It proves the concept that you can use other materials to make records. And let me just skip down to. So going back to the 50s, some of you might remember Wheaties boxes having cardboard records. So you could actually make a record out of paper. But more recently, there have been records, now true, they're somewhat novelty, that use coffee. There's also a video of this that basically, same way that the soap gets crumpled up, you can crumple up the record made out of coffee and then drink it. And then there's also a possibility of plastic straws, because in some locations, plastic straws were banned and replaced with paper straws, right? Well, now I'm sure there are warehouses full of plastic straws, and there's a group, a plastic trade association, that is advocating the use of using plastic straws as a way to make records. But this is my favorite, actually. You could have your ashes once you pass away. You could have your loved ones make sure that your ashes are pressed into a vinyl record. I think I might actually put that in my will. My kids will think I'm absolutely nuts. But so this is a record store near where I live that I actually work at probably once a month until recently. Record Reserve in Northport. And it's, Corona is really taking a big impact. And the store thought it might have to close forever. He's hoping that he's going to be able to reopen in May, from Tim. And then also in the past 9 months, there have been unforeseen problems with the industry. But you know what? The industry keeps on pumping out records. I go back to 2008, that wasn't in the last 9 months. But what happened the last 9 months ago was that the New York Times Magazine published an expose about how Universal Music had been covering up the extent, how extensive the damage was of this fire. And that's being litigated now. And they're, I teach a grad course in crisis communications. Universal Music has done everything that you cannot do amid a crisis, such as lying. And the interesting thing, back in 2008, they had sued NBC for not taking not taking the utmost care of this facility, and sued NBC and said that we lost countless numbers of, who's who of popular music. And then last year, when new litigation on behalf of artists who said, you lost my master recordings. And according to the New York Times article, hundreds of major artists, everyone from like Chuck Berry, had these session recordings, which the vinyl industry desperately needs because it represents recordings no one's ever heard, you know, and some completists like myself, you know, absolutely want to hear not just the albums that we're already familiar with. So what Universal has been saying, well, you know, no records have really been impacted. Yeah, that's true. They do have digital copies of this stuff, but that's not what we're talking about. And then more recently in February, there was a fire that wiped out I mentioned lacquers, Apollo in California and another company, MDC in Japan, are the only two sources today where you can get these lacquers. The good news is there are a couple other companies that are soon going to come to market to be additional suppliers. Apollo's affiliated company, Transco, also made the styling, the needles that the mastering engineers that cut the acetates, you know, absolutely need. That, again, they're going to be new supplies fairly soon for this. And I actually published an article, Elizabeth, I think you have the link if you want to put that in the chat, about how since Corona reared its ugly head, at that point when I was doing these interviews in third week of March or so, surprisingly, the companies were still operating mostly. And even to today, we still anecdotally hear that there really hasn't been like complete shutdown of operations. Now here's something, so I mentioned Record Store Day. Every Record Store Day, there's always a Doors release. And they're usually really, really very, very good. And they're, the individual oversees their estate, you know, is very savvy, and he knows that there's a market. He knows that kids are into the Doors. So I'm going to stop the share for a second because I wanted to show everyone something. So after the last Making Vinyl in October, that next weekend was one of the days I was working at the record store. And the great thing about that experience is I get to pick the music, I'm DJ, you know? So I realized there was a Doors record I was not that familiar with. I'd never heard the entire thing. So it was basically this one, Morrison Hotel. And I'm looking at the sleeve and it says, I don't know if you can see this, but it says 1855 Broadway. And I say to myself, well, that's a very familiar address. And then I go back into the bin and I look at the other Doors records. I almost went into convulsions when I read like the very first Doors record, which I find, you know, dear to me, as well as, you know, the Stooges' first record, also in 1855, one of my favorite all-time records. And also that, I mean, my tastes are not just like that. I also love Judy Collins. This is like one of the most amazing records. So I went into my collection. I found I had like at least 20 records that said 1855 Broadway on it. And I was so intrigued by this that I wrote an article that was published in February. I have that same problem when I switch. Let me just have to stop the share and then do it again. So I managed to write an article about this very strange coincidence, and I call it. I'll just leave it from here. I call it When Worlds Collide because it basically sums up my, pastime. And by the way, I mean, music is only one of the things I write about. I also write about cybersecurity. But Jim Morrison walked through 1855, and John Densmore, the drummer, actually confirmed for me that he remembered mixing the first album in 1855. Unfortunately, he didn't give me much more information than that. But the president of Elektra Records, answered some brief questions, how long they were there. And what I found was they moved in late 1966, and they left in mid 1970 and went across the street to the building that is now the Trump Hotel because they needed more space. But arguably, the Doors were the biggest band in America. I mean, some friends have said, well, what about Creedence Clearwater Revival? Well, true, they had probably more hit singles than the Doors, but I think the Doors were always considered hipper. I mean, you don't see millennials wear Creedence t-shirts, but you do see them wear Jim Morrison t-shirts today. In addition to, in terms of my music writing currently, I had a big thrill of knowing that I just wrote the liner notes to this blues recording in 1957 of Big Bill Broonzy. And although I had contributed liner notes to a CD, George Benson and Al Jarreau release, this is the first time I've ever done a vinyl record. So I'm really, really happy about that. So I will make this available to anybody, the presentation PDF form, if you'd like, and I have some links and things like that listed on that. But I guess we have a few minutes left for questions. Just 5 minutes. Is that right, Elizabeth? Yeah.
That's correct.
Okay.
You can raise your hand for a question, and I can unmute you, or you can type your question into the chat box. However you would like. If we don't have any questions, I'd like to take a minute, and we have a nice job from Brian Ekus. Hope I'm saying that correctly. Herb Savrin is asking to share the turntable info. That's a lot of information, Herb. Maybe we can share that privately afterwards. I didn't have a chance to look at it, actually. Let me unmute you, Herb. Let me just while I have the mic, just talk up our next talk, which is going to be next week, Tuesday, May 5th. And it's another faculty member from Communication Arts. And it's going to be our last event in the Dean's Digital Cafe series. And I'm really excited about this. It's called Shifting the Screen, Independent Cinema in Quarantine, from Andre Dowdy. I hope I'm pronouncing his name correctly, from 12:30 to 1:30. It's going to be a roundtable discussion, and it's going to include people from the Huntington Independent Cinema, whose name I'm blocking on. Who knows this? Jim? Huntington Arts Center. I'm trying to unmute you. I'm trying to unmute you.
Yes.
Cinema Arts Center.
Cinema Arts Center. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Got, yes, I've got quarantine brain now. So this is going to be our last one. We were trying to have a music week this week, but because of illness, our Thursday event has been canceled, unfortunately. So we're very lucky to have Andre pull this thing together, and I'm very appreciative of the whole Department of Communication Arts. And this has been fantastic, Larry. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
For this.
I saw there were a couple of questions. Do we have time for at least one?
Yeah. How can the industry attract even younger people to buy records, such as tweens? And this is from Peter Pavis Wheel.
Okay, I would say the answer to that is social media, especially, you know, that generation, they live by that. And I think they do a really good job. I'm posting on Instagram if they get a record as a present, or, but also once retail reopens, I think it behooves the stores to have special events for that demographic age group. And a lot of these stores also do live events and bring in musicians. I think it's a golden opportunity that they should do.
Thank you, Theda. That's the only question I see. Maybe Larry, you see other questions to you?
The funny thing is I'm having a problem finding the chat.
Okay.
Well,
Here we go.
I got it. Yeah.
Okay.
Is there a course in college devoted to vinyl? I think in Chicago there was something. I forgot which university, but I remember reading something about that. But might be something that we want to consider.
And we have one from Masuk An. Thank you. It was very informative. In terms of money making, is it more, less, nothing?
Well, it depends on how you define success. I mean, there are plenty of individuals who have decided to take the plunge and are making enough money because it's in demand again. Whether they can live off those margins, and if they're basing it on venture capital or angel investors who want quick return on investment, I would say no, don't do it. So,
Great. Thank you, Masuk. Anybody else out there?
all right. Well, thank you, everybody.
Thank you again, Larry, Jeffy, for a really great talk. And I think I have one more hand up. We go. Jing Wang. Oh, just applauding. All right, fantastic.
Oh, thank you.
All right, thank you again, and thank you all the participants for great questions. And stay safe out there, and have a great day. And I hope to see you guys next Tuesday. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.